China's 1A war plan is to launch a Pearl Harbor style strike on American bases on Okinawa because they think they're only going to win if they can really cripple the United States from the start and then quickly absorb Taiwan.
Today, my guest is Michael Beckley, author of Danger Zone, The Coming Conflict with China. What do you think are the prevailing beliefs or maybe myths right now about China and where it stands in relation to the U.S.?
I think there's a couple of myths. One is that China is destined to overtake the United States as a superpower. I think people just look at its economic growth rates, the size of its economy, its big push in the military realm. And China certainly has formidable assets, but they just sort of project ahead and assume that China is going to continue to grow like gangbusters and that the Chinese regime are brilliant strategists that have this long-term plan, whereas the United States is chaotic and shambolic and can't even plan for the next 2 years, let alone the course of this century. So that's one myth that we try to take on. And then the other is just that means U.S.-China competition is going to be more like a 100-year marathon, to use a popular phrase, or a new Cold War in which both sides have decades to kind of get their house in order and rally coalitions. We think that while China's certainly not going away anytime soon, it's actually faces many more headwinds than people are probably aware of and is likely to be a peaking power rather than a declining power sooner than we think. And we also think that the sharpest phase of U.S.-China competition could be more like a 10-year sprint this decade. There's a number of areas where China is likely to push very quickly, precisely because Chinese leaders are looking ahead at the long-term trends, which are actually not that favorable for them. And so they need to try to change things in the short term. They need to try to rekindle their rise or just grab what they can while they still can. So we try to put these things out there and get plenty of feedback from lots of different people.
Mm-hmm. So what is the evidence behind this theory that China would make this more immediate push when they're a peaking power?
Well, we go back through history and we show that we look at every case basically where you had a peaking power. These are great powers that have been growing much faster than the world average, growing in international power and prestige, and then their economies start to slow down or they start to get strategically encircled by their rivals or both. And what we found is that none of these peaking powers mellowed out and dialed back their ambitions. They all expanded abroad and actually became much more aggressive because they were trying to batter their way through these trends. So there are catastrophic cases, like Germany starts World War I in Europe largely because it's worried it's going to get crushed in a Russian and French vice around them. Imperial Japan starts World War II in Asia in large part because they're worried that the Americans were going to choke out their empire there. But there's also many more less extreme examples. So the United States, after the Civil War, has this big economic boom, and then it has a series of economic depressions in the 1880s, 1890s, and the Americans react by saying, we've run out of greenfield investment opportunities here on the American continent. We need to expand abroad. And that's when you have this surge of American imperialism, starts pumping exports and investment into Latin America and East Asia, and then builds a big navy to guard those investments and starts annexing territory there, again, to kind of carve out this empire. We even look at Russia in recent years. So, Russia was a resurgent power in the 2000s, where it was racking out, 8% economic growth rates, largely because of high oil prices. Then when those oil prices decline after the 2008 financial crisis, they dragged down Russia's economy and Vladimir Putin's popularity along with it. And he tries to revive Russia's fortunes by trying to force essentially former Soviet states to join a Russian-dominated customs union, where they basically become economic vassals of Russia. And, as we well know, a big part of Ukraine doesn't want to do that. They want to sign a comprehensive trade agreement with the EU that sets up the showdown that culminates in the toppling of the government there in Ukraine, and then the Russian annexation of Crimea, the insurgency in eastern Ukraine, and then that sets up this range of hostility that we are seeing the outcome of today. So that you just have this pattern over and over again play out in history, where it's the rise followed by the fear of an impending stagnation and fall that causes these once rising powers to become much more aggressive. And we just worry that China is starting to inch its way down that ugly historical path now.
And you found many examples. Do you think that there is a counterexample or a way to prevent this?
It's tough in China's case because the main, the counter examples we found are, for example, Japan after World War II has a big economic boom. It's rising. And a lot of people thought that it was going to become the dominant power. I remember as a child in the 80s, I was terrified that the Japanese were going to take over the world, even though I'm half Japanese. And so, and obviously in that case, Japan didn't react with aggression. Although they did expand their military quite a bit and pump out a lot of investment, but the problem is that it's almost the exception that proves the rule, because Japan has a lot of things that China doesn't have today. It had an alliance with the United States. They were security partners, not rivals. It had a democratic government. We found that actually democracies tend to react a little bit better to these situations because the Democratic leaders are representing a broader coalition of supporters, some of which favor more sort of laissez-faire free trade kind of remedies, others which favor imperialism or expansion, but at least there's more of a balance. In authoritarian regimes, you tend to have very tight links between, state-owned enterprises and big business that want new markets abroad. And you have a regime that's much more worried about its legitimacy because it doesn't have popular elections to kind of rejuvenate that every 4 years. And so they tend to lash out more. Japan wasn't a revanchist power the way that China is today. I mean, according to the CCP's narrative, there are lost Chinese territories that need to be taken back one way or another. Mm-hmm. And they've cultivated that sense of really dark nationalism based on this idea of the century of humiliation that China was unjustifiably ripped apart. And they can never let that happen again. And the CCP says we're the ones that solved that problem. And so any sense that there's pushback internationally, any slight, any setback to China's rise, we've seen it with the wolf warrior diplomacy, is basically given a fully hostile response. And so we just worry that China doesn't fit the profile of a peaking power that would take it lightly. It looks much more like the more extreme kind of examples of these authoritarian, revisionist, revanchist powers. When they get pushback, they tend to shove back even harder.
Mm-hmm. That brings me to a question from one of our listeners, too, about another issue that China is facing. He'd like to know, what is your opinion on China's massively aging population problem?
Yeah, it's actually, every time I study this, I feel like it gets worse than what I originally had thought it would be. I mean, so the headline numbers are that China's population, now that we're getting new numbers from the new census that was just partially released in China, it looks like China's population may fall by half by the 2060s or 2070s, whereas previously we thought by 2100 China's population would collapse in half. But it's not even just a long-term problem. It's actually a short-term problem. Just over 10 years from now, so in the early 2030s, between now and then, China is going to lose 70 million working-age adults and gain about 120 to 130 million senior citizens. So that's like taking an entire France of workers and taxpayers and consumers out of your population and adding an entire Japan of senior citizens. And that's happening in just over a decade. And the projections I've seen suggest that China is going to have to triple the amount it spends as a share of its economy on elder care of various forms, pensions, social security, medical care. And we've never seen this kind of fiscal crunch or demographic collapse from a country. And it really just has to do with China's peculiar population history with the one-child policy, throwing, China's population. It's basically having this big baby boom generation that's going to retire and fall back on this tiny one-child generation. And so that's why you get such an extreme crunch in the numbers.
Mm-hmm. So there is obviously a cost with this aging population. I've spoken to someone from the Wall Street Journal about China, and he said that China has this issue of potentially growing old before growing rich. Mm-hmm. Is there hope for the Chinese economy that it's so strong, growing so fast, that it can absorb this aging population? Or how do those things look to you?
I don't think so. So there's this whole literature on the so-called middle income trap, mm-hmm. and I actually think it's almost impossible for China to avoid that. And because it's not just that the population is aging, it has a lot to do with the severe underinvestment in education for a big part of China's population. So basically, first of all, let me just explain. Like the idea of the middle income trap is just that poor countries, they can grow fast initially, but they tend to get stuck at about $10,000 per year per person or less, so sort of middle income status, because you can grow fast initially because there's all this low-hanging fruit. There's easy fixes you can make in your economy. You can move peasants into factories that makes them much more productive. You can build roads that suddenly open up new areas of economic development. Your wages are typically low, which makes your exports very cost competitive. But then as you enter this middle income status, all those low-hanging fruit have been picked, and so growth will start to slow unless you can figure out a way to now start educating factory workers to become office workers and entrepreneurs. And, now that you've paved the roads, you need to find ways to innovate. And I think China could get stuck here just because the only countries that have blasted through this middle income trap had highly educated populations. They had 75% or so of their population with a high school degree. China today, only 30% of its current workforce has gone to high school, and that's dead last among middle income countries. And I think Westerners just aren't aware of this problem because it's taking place largely outside the big cities where most Westerners never travel. But 70% of China's children today are in rural areas, and in those areas it's a completely different China than the one that most people are used to seeing. Out there, people live on less than $10 a day. Education and healthcare are abysmal, and there's been major studies that have come out recently showing that roughly half of these children in rural areas are undernourished. A third of them have IQs under 90, which means it's going to be very difficult for them to do even basic like middle school math. They have worms in their stomachs, so they struggle to learn, they fall behind, and they're essentially unemployable in a modern economy. And that wasn't a problem 20 years ago when there was lots of construction jobs and factory jobs. But now that all those roads have been built and factories are starting to move to places like Vietnam where labor costs are lower, there just aren't as many jobs. And there's been studies, particularly these ones by a research team at Stanford, that estimates there may be 200 to 300 million unemployable workers entering China's economy in the coming years, and many of them are going to be men because of the one-child policy. Families aborted baby girls, so you've got 40 million extra men that will never marry. Many of them may be unemployable, and so we don't really know how this is going to play out, but it doesn't bode well for China entering and continue to advance and blast through these demographic problems. I mean, we've seen in Mexico and Brazil where they had much smaller sort of versions of this problem, and the result was a surge in crime and violence because these undereducated men, they say, well, I'm not just going to whitewash windows on the side of the street. I'm going to find other ways to earn. And it tends to be very bad for the social fabric of the nation, as well as obviously the productivity of the economy.
Yeah, I was speaking with someone just yesterday who's a historian who's talking about how cultures that have lots of men, or even pioneering organizations that have lots of men, and then they say, well, if there's no women, there's no biological future for us. Mm-hmm. And then they tend to lash out, attack others, and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's, some people say China is likely to be not so aggressive because of the one-child policy, because you have so many families that only have one child. They don't want to risk them, and that's somehow going to pressure the regime to, back off Taiwan. I worry that you could have an opposite situation where the regime's like, we have 40 million men who have no prospect of getting married. I actually think this is part of the impetus behind the Belt and Road Initiative, where they sent lots of men to go work abroad and build infrastructure because they were gainfully employed and out of the country. But you could imagine in a military scenario, the regime may be less casualty averse because they view these men as essentially surplus and potential sources of instability. So, they're more likely to be willing to throw them into a meat grinder and take risks that way. So I'm not sure how that can play out, but I worry very much about just the sex imbalance on top of the demographic pressures on the regime.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, you talked about the population being undereducated, much of it. This comes as a surprise, I think, to most Westerners, particularly Americans, when we see so many very talented Chinese students in our universities and things like that. What do you think? What else do you think could make for that perception, or is it really just a myth?
Well, I think because China has invested heavily at the highest end of education. So they've built their version of the Ivy League, where they've really propped up the big name universities, Beida, Tsinghua, and they've made them, world-class universities. And they also have heavily funded science and engineering research and development. So they have more scientists and engineers, technically, according to their definition of what meets those criteria, than any other country in the world. And then you just have the fact that, most Westerners, even, a lot of people with a platform, like journalists or scholars who are writing about China. They spend you fly in through the world-class, airport in Beijing. You go to the 5-star hotel. You go to the banquet and meet with a bunch of elites, and they tell you how great the country is doing, and then you fly back out. So you can see how this affects the perception. I think there's also just the fear of China can be a very useful fundraising device for a lot of different groups. So there's sort of built-in incentives that can include everything from the military, obviously wanting to say we have this big threat we have to confront, we need to buy more weapons. There's Congress, political leaders that want to blame job losses in their district on the rise of China rather than their own policies. You also have tech firms that want government funding to train their workforces. So they say if we don't do that, China is going to eat our lunch. So there's just all these political factors that I think also help play in and hype the rise of China. And just in media, you're going to sell a lot more books or get more clicks if you have titles like, When China Rules the World, than, a title like, well, maybe China has some weaknesses and we should pay attention to that. It's just not as, gripping, I think, as the bigger narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in your book, I think in the introduction, it says the rise of China may be one of the most searched topics in all of news media over the last few years. Michael?
It literally was the most read article of the 21st century, I think, until Donald Trump came along. There's places that track it, and the rise of China was literally the number one most read topic around the world.
Mm-hmm. So, Michael, for you personally, you said that growing up you were concerned with Japan taking over the world. What got you now so interested in China? You've also written books about the strength of the U.S. What made China the thing that you wanted to put your career on?
Well, so I put myself in the camp of people that had presumed that China was going to sort of take over the world. I remember when I got to when I was as a student, and especially as a graduate student in the 2000s, I was going to write my dissertation, and I assumed that all these analyses and looking at the growth rates that China was going to become this superpower that would rival the United States. And so I initially set out to write a dissertation about sort of power transition management. How can you create this power transition between the two countries without starting a catastrophic war? But then once I moved to China and lived there and really immersed myself and started just looking around, I mean, it didn't really fit the picture of a rising superpower. I just became much more aware of all the liabilities and weaknesses and headwinds that China faces. And then when I started digging through the data, I just found things where, like, in certain areas, like even something as basic as per capita income, there was this chronic gap between the United States and China that even despite its rapid growth rates, because it was starting from such a low base, it was lagging so far behind. And that's before even these now the demographic headwinds, et cetera, are going to kick in. So I just became much more skeptical about China's rise. And as I've watched China's growth rates steadily decline, the number of internal crises they've had, as well as the external pressure from countries that are now starting to gang up on China, it's just sort of fed that impression that I've had, that I charted in my first book and now added on to with the second book.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about that ganging up or that encirclement around China. I think that's something that I haven't heard much about, but I really found in detail in your work.
Yeah, so I mean, just in recent years, negative views of China have soared to levels we haven't seen since the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre. In the United States, I would say getting tough with China is one of the few bipartisan issues we have. But even places like the European Union has labeled China a systemic rival and is looking for ways to sort of insulate European economies from there. And then in Asia, China now faces essentially quasi-hostile governments really in every direction, from Japan, which is doubling its defense spending. Australia, joined this AUKUS alliance and is gearing up. Vietnam is loading up on all kinds of military hardware and trying to take business away from China as its wages rise. And even countries that used to trade heavily with China and lean towards it diplomatically are starting to have second thoughts. So surveys show that South Koreans, for example, now dislike China more than they dislike Japan, which is remarkable given, the brutality that Japan inflicted on South Korea. And so there's anti-China sentiment, and it's now starting to congeal into various forms of pushback. I would say there's two key features of this. One is this sort of loose economic bloc that's emerging, really anchored by the G7, where you have this group of rich democratic countries that control more than half the world's wealth, and they are working with sort of a rotating cast of partners to try to figure out ways to prevent China from monopolizing parts of the global economy. They don't want China to become the dominant dispenser of medical PPE or semiconductors or rare earths, because they just worry about the Amazon effect, that China will be able to basically use that as a coercive tool to not only expand its market access, but its geopolitical power. And so they're now engaging in lots of joint R&D projects. They're forming these sort of mini export control regimes that are cutting China off from advanced technologies. Like semiconductors is one key example of that. And they're also inking trade and investment deals that basically explicitly discriminate against China. They put in place labor and environmental standards that China could never hope to meet. And then the second feature is this military barrier in Asia, where you have the powers that border China are loading up on missile launchers and mines and things that can basically push China away from their coastlines. And then you have this outside layer of mostly democratic powers, the United States, Australia, the UK, Japan, India, all bankrolling and helping China's weaker neighbors build up their militaries and stand up to China. And you're also having the popping up of these anti-China alliances, the Quad, being resurrected as one, AUKUS is another. And so I think it's not that the Chinese are facing critical, like they're about to be crushed by all these countries, but I think it's just an ominous sign for the Chinese that countries are now just much more aware. They're less enthralled by the money to be made in China's market and more worried about its coercive behavior and its military buildup. And so they're now starting to form alliances and build up their own capabilities to push back.
Mm-hmm. As far as allies for China in their area, what do you think of China's relationship with North Korea? What does that look like to you?
When I was spending a lot of time in China in the 2010s, it was quite apparent that Chinese strategists were sort of apoplectic about the North Koreans, because they just felt that North Korea had become such a liability at this point. Because as you'll probably remember, North Korea actually did a number of provocative things in killing lots of South Korean sailors, and launching artillery attacks, and then obviously building up its nuclear weapons and missile programs, which were then causing Japan and the United States to strengthen their missile defense systems and deploy them and sell them to South Korea. So it was just causing all of this strategic blowback onto China from North Korea's belligerence. And, they felt like, we're getting frustrated. We've told the North Koreans, why don't you just do what we did, and selectively open up and try to build up your economy somewhat and maybe dial back less the tension. And the North Koreans clearly don't want to go in that direction. So they were very frustrated. But on the other hand, I just don't think they have great options either. At the end of the day, they value North Korea as this critical buffer between them and the South Koreans. They certainly don't want a North Korean collapse that could cause a reunified Korean peninsula with potentially American military bases on that territory, as well as a flood of refugees and loose nuclear weapons, flowing around near China's borders. So I think they're sort of exasperated because they're very frustrated with the North Koreans. They see them as a liability, but they also can't really easily give them up. And I think they're just hoping to kick the can down the road continually, because there's no better option than the status quo.
Mm-hmm. I've heard a North Korean refugee say that she believes that China is essentially funding North Korea, that North Korea would be inept without China. What do you make of that?
I think there is a lot of truth behind that, because North Korea relies on China both for legal forms of trade, but also to get around sanctions. And it's not even something that the Chinese regime can quickly turn off, because you just have lots of Chinese companies that will set up these smuggling networks essentially to get around the export controls and the sanctions that have been imposed on North Korea. So I think there's tremendous truth, and that's why the Americans are always trying to get the Chinese to turn the screw on North Korea, but the Chinese are obviously reluctant to do that, because they just worry that if you destabilize that regime, it's just going to be much worse. It's going to be terrible for China.
Mm-hmm. As tension rises in Asia, you've written an interesting scenario in your book about a possible invasion of Taiwan. What do you think are the possibilities for an invasion of Taiwan?
Well, I mean, I think major war is always unlikely, but I just worry that the likelihood of war in the Taiwan Strait is higher than any time I can remember in my lifetime, even higher than in 1995, 96, where you had a crisis there. I mean, I just start from the point that, first of all, every Chinese leader has said Taiwan will be reabsorbed. It's just a matter of when and how. And I've just noticed this major shift in China's strategy. I mean, up until 2016, I think China took a relatively peaceful approach where they tried to use economic clout, just manifest destiny. We're just going to get Taiwan so reliant on our economy that they're eventually just going to come back to the fold. But that strategy clearly hasn't worked because Taiwan's people have just become more and more determined to be independent or de facto independent from the mainland. And so as these peaceful reunification options have disappeared, China has clearly started flexing its military muscle. And what Hal Brands and I write about in our book is that there is this kind of window of opportunity for China that it could rush through, because on the one hand, its military capabilities have surged in recent years because China has been producing ammunition, advanced missiles extremely quickly and loading up on those, as well as pumping out warships at a rate that no country has matched since the Second World War. And at the same time, the United States and Taiwan have been very slow to spread out their forces, make them more resilient. And so it's just opened up the possibility for China to conduct a preemptive or a surprise attack on Taiwan's bases and the American bases on Okinawa that would really cripple their offensive forces and set them way back. And then maybe China could carry out a fait accompli over Taiwan. And this window of opportunity is going to get better for China in the next few years because we're about to witness the mass retirement of aging U.S. Huge warships, the big cruisers, the guided missile submarines, the long-range bombers. Most of these things were built by the Ronald Reagan administration at the end of the Cold War. And so the United States is literally going to have hundreds fewer missile launchers floating and flying around East Asia. And so China has this chance, but that chance could slam shut in the 2030s because Taiwan and the United States have these very ambitious plans that could make the island essentially unconquerable by then. And so we just worry that the Chinese are looking at this saying, look, there's no peaceful options. Right now is the best chance we're ever going to have militarily. Why not rush through that? We've seen this happen in history. And just given the kind of rhetoric that's coming out of China, given the preparations that seem to be gearing up the population for the possibility of a major war, we've just become very concerned. We don't think that war is likely, but it's gone from a very, very low likelihood event to a somewhat unlikely, but more likely than I'm comfortable with kind of event.
Mm-hmm. What is Taiwan doing to become inconquerable?
So the basic strategy is what defense analysts call the porcupine strategy, where Taiwan obviously can't beat China in a straight up war, but it can exploit two factors. One is geography. So Taiwan is an island, and the waters around Taiwan are very typhoons and huge waves are common in the Taiwan Strait. And there's only about 14 beaches where an invasion force could even land, because most of Taiwan's shores are these mud flats that extend out 2 to 5 miles. An invasion force would get bogged down, or they're cliffs where you can't, there's not a whole lot you can do. And so that geographic advantage, coupled with the state of modern military technology, precision-guided munitions, it's become much easier for a weaker force to blow things up than it was before, because you can do precision targeting, and Taiwan is already stocked up on lots of missiles. The basic strategy is to do that even more, to have just so many mobile missile launchers, smart drones, mines that could basically create a high-tech minefield in and around Taiwan that would make an invasion or blockade almost impossible, because China has to mass forces to conquer Taiwan. It has to send a big invasion force across or maintain a blockade, lots of big warships out at sea for extended periods. Those are sitting ducks for these kind of munitions. So what people say is Taiwan could just load up on these things as well as build up its army and get them ready for a war of attrition should Chinese forces land. And hopefully by doing this, you deter the Chinese, because they look at what's happening to Russia and say, we don't want to end up in a grinding war of attrition that we could end up losing. So let's not go for it. So that's kind of the hope. It's just that things have been very slow, both in Taiwan and the United States, to make that strategy a reality.
Mm-hmm. You said war of attrition. My first instinct is that a war of attrition with a country with such a big population as China, it would be almost not a factor. Is there a distinction with Taiwan's demographics or something else that would make that a relevant conflict?
Well, it's a very good point, because obviously China not only has a huge population, but has major industrial capacity. Mm-hmm. And in recent years, from a military perspective, can outpace even the United States, because for example, in the United States, some of its advanced missiles, there's literally one factory in the entire country that makes those missiles. So if that factory goes down, the United States, how is it going to mobilize for a longer, protracted conflict? And so, I think for China, though, the one thing you do have to factor in is just it's really hard to get armies across a body of water. We've just seen that historically. This is why even Hitler, when he got to the English Channel, was having problems, right? And so it's just really hard to gear that up. Now, could China just throw its entire population to it? Maybe. But I don't know how quickly, we're seeing, like with Russia's case, that if you're a dictator, you also have to worry that if the war, what you've advertised as a quick smash and grab operation, turns into a total war where you have to mobilize the entire population, can you count on popular support? Is that going to threaten your regime? So I think there are some, at least, notes of caution that China would have. But I agree with you that this war probably could become protracted, and China's huge population and industrial capacity would give it a major advantage.
So if the window seems to be closing for China, and Taiwan seems to have a path out in the near future, what would be scenarios where conflict could rise in this window?
Well, I think, first of all, the timetable is probably China's own timetable. So some people are looking for like a spark, that people worried with Nancy Pelosi's recent visit that this was going to spark the war. I actually don't think that's the case. I think it's more that the Chinese will look for times of military advantage. And that's why Hal Brands and I worry so much about the next 5 years or so, when we think China will have its largest advantage, because their interests are set. I mean, they want to reabsorb Taiwan. That's not going to change. And I think they also feel that trends are not going to be going in their direction diplomatically, because they've just noticed sort of a slippery slope of rising international support for Taiwan, at the same time that the Taiwanese people, if you look at opinion polls, think of themselves as Taiwanese and not as Chinese in ever greater numbers. And that's especially true among the younger generation. So I think they just see the long-term trends being bad for them. And so the only question is, when would our key military window of opportunity be? And I think that's clearly going to be in the latter half of the 2020s. So I don't think it's going to be a spark. I think they've actually used something like Nancy Pelosi's visit to normalize this massive military presence in the Taiwan Strait, which could actually give them tactical advantages, because they could go out pretending like they're doing another exercise and then quickly make a mad dash, for the beaches, or already have the blockade force they'd already want set up, because they've already surrounded Taiwan, ready to go. And that would, a key advantage that the United States should have is that China would normally take a long time to mobilize for a war like this. And during that mobilization period, you could start to pick apart China's forces. But if they're already up and running from day one, and the United States and Taiwan are on the back foot, China can just fully exploit that advantage of surprise.
Mm-hmm. So you're linking the U.S. and Taiwan. I wonder, what role specifically do you think that the United States plays in Taiwan's security?
I mean, I think if there's an invasion attempt, the United States is going to be looking to try to sink China's amphibious fleet to the full extent possible. Whether that'll entail strikes on the Chinese mainland, I don't know, but I think certainly you'll have essentially unrestricted air and missile strikes on the invasion force, potentially while certainly if they're getting to the beaches in Taiwan, but even potentially if they're loading in mainland ports, just because you don't want to even give them the chance to get across. I think that's very clear, even though the U.S. commitment to Taiwan is notoriously ambiguous, right? The United States says it has an interest in the peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue, but it doesn't specify what it would do to uphold that. I just think that if you look at where opinion is on Capitol Hill, if you look at certainly within the Pentagon, I mean, they've been planning for this war for I would say decades, but certainly over the last decade. So and President Biden himself has said, the United States would defend Taiwan militarily, and that it's a commitment that the United States made, which kind of goes above and beyond what most American diplomats would normally say. All of that signals to me that the United States would be involved in the war. And I actually think it may not even be America's choice, because China's 1A war plan is to launch a Pearl Harbor style strike on American bases on Okinawa, because they think that's they're only going to win if they can really cripple the United States from the start and then quickly absorb Taiwan. If you leave those bases intact, then the huge fist of American striking power in Asia is there and ready to fight on. I think the Chinese have learned from Russia's sort of stumbling into Ukraine that you don't give the adversary time, you don't take things for granted, you go big and brutal from the start. And so the United States may not even have a choice in being directly involved in the war if China does implement a war plan like that.
If Okinawa were compromised, then where does that put the U.S.?
It would be a massive setback because the two big bases on Okinawa are the only American military bases within 500 miles of Taiwan, and that's a big problem because American fighter aircraft run out of gas. Their combat radius is 1,000 miles or less, and so the next major military base. I mean, you have some way up on the Japanese mainland, but then the big one is on Guam, which is more than 1,000 miles away. And so it would force the United States to have to do mid-air refueling, which is a very complex operation. So it would cut the number of sorties that the United States could fly around Taiwan by more than half. And then whatever American forces are coming in are going to have to fight their way into the combat theater, potentially through a hail fire of Chinese missiles and mines and electromagnetic interference. And so it's just harder to come in from over the horizon than to be able to operate from nearby bases. And this is why a big part of the reforms the United States is planning to make and hopefully will make is to spread out its base infrastructure in East Asia, rely less on these putting all your eggs in a couple of baskets right near that are sitting ducks for China, spread them out and create a much more resilient force.
To get away from this sort of direct action, what do you notice China doing that is cyber, AI-based, that sort of thing?
So China's been obviously investing heavily in cyber and electronic warfare, and Chinese strategic documents, you can go back to the 1990s, especially after the Gulf War, where they just watched the Iraqis get massacred by the Americans because the Americans had harnessed, using satellites and sensors to view the whole battlefield, and then anything you can see can be targeted and wiped out. China, which had a military that looked a lot like Iraq's, a big sort of old school 20th century kind of force, would be highly vulnerable to that. And so the Chinese said the only way we can defeat the Americans is if we blind them, render their forces deaf, blind, and dumb at the start. And so I think it would be a matter of course that the Chinese would be basically throwing up this wall of electromagnetic interference so that the United States can't do targeting, can't find targets on the ground, can't communicate with each other. And whether they would also conduct cyber attacks on the American mainland or civilian infrastructure, I'm not so sure. But I think it's guaranteed that China will be trying to potentially even take down American satellites. They tested anti-satellite weapons most notoriously in 2007, where they blew up the satellite that scattered debris all over orbits around the Earth. And I think that just shows their intent. I think they were doing that to sort of signal that, hey, we will try to blind you from the start. And that is really the soft underbelly of American military power. We have all these powerful weapons, but if you don't have the sensors, the communications networks to guide them, you're bringing in forces from potentially thousands of miles away. How are you going to do that if you can't talk to each other, if you can't see what's going on? And I think the Chinese will definitely try to exploit that.
Yeah. Michael, you did an interesting piece with Wired talking about Chinese hacking and people's personal data. What are you noticing with hacking?
There's just going to be the FBI says it's opening up a new China case, every hour or maybe even less than that. And so, there's just clearly this campaign largely for commercial espionage to hack various databases. But I think what concerns me, it's hard to say why, but just that China, there's been hacks where China has clearly pilfered personal data on millions and millions and millions and millions of Americans. They have all my data. I was lost in the Office of Personnel Management, where they hacked into anyone that had security clearances basically in the U.S. and got their data. But big hotel chains, credit card companies, and at this point, I would say it's a safe bet that they have good information, the basic information on most Americans at this point. And now you have application, TikTok, you have an entire generation of American youth just putting videos and giving over their personal information on these apps that are ultimately linked to Chinese companies that can send data back to Beijing. I don't know what the Chinese plan to do with this data, but clearly they have some kind of strategy to suck up as much of this data as possible. And just given the various conflicts of interest that the United States has with China, I just think it's very concerning, even if we don't exactly know what they're trying to do with that data.
You mentioned TikTok, and in your book, I think you highlight certain nations that have banned it for security reasons. What influence do you think TikTok has, or the data that they're gathering from that?
Well, I think it's part of a broader strategy where China wants to become the world's largest data broker. So like Xi Jinping has said, data is the new oil. And so their strategy is clearly to, first of all, wall China's data off from the rest of the world to prevent, the security leaks and to kind of concentrate the economic benefits, while at the same time buying or stealing as much data from other countries as possible. There's just been this raft of new laws that China has passed where they require, for example, all firms, foreign firms operating in China have to store their data locally and grant the CCP full access. If you work in a foreign firm over there, you can't even send a memo about data from China to another country, basically without Beijing's blessing. And this is why Apple and Tesla and other major tech firms have been rushing to build dedicated Chinese data centers. And so China is just sort of sucking up data from abroad, hacking multinational corporation databases. And I think it's just a strategy. I don't know what else they're going to do with it, but they certainly feel like this has now become the most important resource in the world because it empowers artificial intelligence, which I think the Chinese Communist Party is hoping will be the solution to many of their problems. That they have this aging workforce. Well, we can make up for that with lots of smart machines. We've destroyed all of our farmland. Okay, well we can use data to come up with synthetic biology solutions to that. We have a conflict with the United States. Well, we can use artificial intelligence to enhance our military power. So I think they just say, let's suck up as much data as possible, cram them through these algorithms, make them super smart, and then use that for a huge advantage over other countries. That seems to be the strategy. I don't know how effective it'll ultimately be, but it just shows the intent and something that I think Americans should be very aware of and wary of.
Mm-hmm. How do you think China's abilities in AI compare to, say, the U.S. or Western powers?
That's a good question. I think on the advantage side, obviously you have the population and, you have 800 million, maybe even more than that now, internet users in China. Some people say it's the Saudi Arabia of data for that reason. Mm. You also just have the benefit of an authoritarian regime that doesn't have to worry about, pesky things like individual rights and privacy. And so you can suck up and use the data for whatever purposes the Chinese want. Now, whether those advantages are as big as most people think, I'm a little bit more skeptical just because I think, first of all, data has diminishing returns. The difference between 10 data points and a million is huge, but the difference between like a million data points and 10 million may not be as big. At a certain point, you just have enough data. American tech firms are also global, whereas many Chinese firms are still largely concentrated in China's protected market. And I think a lot of tech firms now are starting to use simulated data, where you're clustering data and creating these more refined groupings. Instead of having all this big, messy, noisy, big data sets, you try to cluster data in more refined groups, and then you can simulate data and basically use video games to train algorithms. That just seems to be more the wave of the future. And one thing that China lags on are the sort of human skills, the really high-end human skills you need to design really complex algorithms. China still lags pretty far behind the United States, which is doing a lot of the design for major technology today. So how this will ultimately play out, Kai-Fu Lee has his AI Superpowers book where he says, well, at this point, it's more about just cramming through lots of data, and China has it, and the authoritarian government. But I tend to think, the more people that are directly involved in these industries I talk to, that those advantages can be vastly overstated.
Mm. You mentioned pesky human rights. What do you notice with the human rights issues in China that maybe people aren't aware of?
Well, I think, first of all, China has set up the most advanced surveillance and repression system we've ever seen in human history. I mean, you've reached a point now where there are just hundreds of millions of security cameras all over the country. They put half the cities or more under what they call grid-style management, where you just have security forces that chopping up each neighborhood into little blocks and then surveilling them constantly. And they're making use of speech and facial recognition technology to basically be able to pick people out, and they're using social media for propaganda that's much more advanced than the kind of stodgy propaganda you've seen from past authoritarian regimes. And I think it's part and parcel of a broader, it doesn't just affect what's going on in China, it's part of a broader assault on democracy, that China actually has a vested interest in preventing the spread of democracy and trying to spread autocracy. And I think the Chinese embarked on this because they viewed the world, and especially trends after the end of the Cold War, as hostile, where you had the number of democracies actually doubled, since the end of the Cold War. And China's leaders really chafed at that pressure. It was one thing when their economy was booming. They could easily tell people, clearly autocracy is the best system for China, even if it's not the best system for other countries. But now that the growth is slowing, they have to worry that people are going to start to question their model. And so they're looking for ways to prop up not only their own authoritarian regime, but those around the world, because they fear a sort of democratic domino effect of the kind that brought down lots of communist regimes in quick succession in 1989, or the kind of Arab Spring style revolutions that suddenly percolated and proliferated all over the Middle East. I mean, Xi, just like Putin, is constantly fretting about color revolutions, because they know what political scientists have actually proved empirically, that these things do tend to spread, that they tend, revolution or instability in one autocracy tends to generate revolution in others. And so Xi Jinping feels his rule will be safer if authoritarianism is prevalent and reinforced in China. And now with these new digital technologies, I mean, this system just makes authoritarianism much more efficient and effective than ever before, and I think poses a real threat, not just to human rights within China, but to the state of democracy around the world.
Mm-hmm. What human rights issues do you notice happening in China right now? You've written in your book about certain minorities and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the obvious example of this is what's going on in Xinjiang, where, China has, set up concentration camps, and they exist side by side with these what they call smart cities, which they advertise as ways to make the trains run on time and improve crime fighting, but also obviously empower an authoritarian surveillance state. And so if you just look at what's going on in Xinjiang today, it's actually terrifying, not just from a human rights perspective, but from what it says about the intentions and the kind of psychology of the Chinese regime, because you have a system where you have Chinese security officers manning these concentration camps. They are engaging in forced sterilization of Uyghur women. So when these women, they get a health check that they have to go to, and they receive a flu shot, and suddenly they're not having their period as much anymore. You've just seen Uyghur birth rates fall off a cliff. At the same time that you have cameras and biometric scanners and mandatory cell phone apps that are just tracking everyone in the province. You have DNA swabs being taken at health checks that are set up. When Uyghurs pump gas, the system checks whether they're the car's owner. If they try to flee, police are dispatched to their friends and families' houses as sort of a threat that if you try to run, we'll take it out on your family. There's even been cases where Uyghurs have fled and made it abroad, but some of China's authoritarian allies have extradited them back to China using some of the surveillance technology they originally purchased from China. So Egypt, for example, deported a bunch of Uyghurs back into Beijing's clutches. And so, if that's the system that China is pioneering to do social control, I just think it's a very powerful system. It's one that is incredibly attractive to authoritarian leaders and aspiring autocrats around the world. And so I think it just poses a unique threat to those that believe in democracy that we just haven't seen in history before.
What stops organizations that do believe in these sort of things from stepping in, something like the United Nations?
Well, the United Nations at this point, I mean, it's such a broad tent because you're trying to represent every single country. And so it just becomes there's just so many veto points. It's just really hard to get concerted action. I was actually surprised by their recent statement on Xinjiang, which was, I would say, watered down, but at least called out China for what the U.S. government calls a genocide in Xinjiang. But China, I think, has been very savvy in terms of ensconcing itself in international organizations and the United Nations in particular. I mean, Chinese officials have leadership positions in several of the main human rights bodies within the United Nations. And so they're able to kind of bend those international institutions in an authoritarian direction, kind of water it down, or just create this, everybody does bad things kind of impression, this sort of equivalence between, something like, they like to harp on the genocide of the Native Americans in the United States, or today the treatment of African Americans. They've been hyping up like the George Floyd sort of thing. So they try to create this perception that there's abuses going on all over the place. They also try to promote this vision of a well-ordered, harmonious, hierarchical society as being actually better than the kind of chaos and partisanship and infighting you see in democracies. And so this has really I think, kneecapped the ability of any international organization, at least one that claims to represent, most countries in the world, from really having concerted action against China. It's going to require more the United States and its allies kind of assembling coalitions of the willing to really impose costs for these human rights abuses.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of the things that we've been talking about, it seems China has this window. China is eager to move up in the world. Should China become the world leader, what do you think a China-led order would look like?
Well, I think it's actually pretty clear. There's always these articles like, what does China want? And I think it's always been actually relatively, Chinese leaders have been saying the same things overall. I think they said, look, first of all, there are lost Chinese territories that we will take back. So that obviously included Hong Kong, Taiwan, about 80% of the East and South China Seas, and Austria-sized chunks of India. So first of all, those now are Chinese territory. So that's the first part. And then the second is beyond the sort of control of physical territory, is sort of an economic empire that gravitates around Beijing. This idea that China can basically create new markets abroad and then link them back to Beijing. The Belt and Road Initiative is a clear attempt to do this, where China has extended now more than $1 trillion in sovereign loans, and countries have taken these loans largely to employ Chinese workers, to build infrastructure, and then install Chinese telecommunications and those smart city systems we just talked about. And so it's this kind of neo-imperialism, creating these sinospheres that potentially lock Chinese partners into a tight economic embrace with China that then forces them to side with China on all kinds of issues, human rights issues, Taiwan, if there's a conflict with the West. And China has already shown that it's willing to be, this is not like a reemergence of a liberal order, an open trading regime, that China will actually pressure its partners, and they will threaten to cancel access to credit, or they'll cancel more profitable projects. So there's been cases where countries have said, this project you're building here is going to bankrupt us. Like, we don't want it anymore. It's clearly a bridge to nowhere. And the Chinese have made very clear that if they cancel that project, they will then lose access to X, Y, and Z other projects, or access to finance, or access to China's huge market. So it's just this idea of forging relationships of dependency. And I just think that hierarchical vision is one that is well entrenched in Chinese strategic thought and discourse, and I think would certainly be something that China would try to do if its power can increase in the years ahead.
Mm-hmm. How would that impact things like our freedoms here in the U.S. if China were to be a world leader? Could we expect to live in a sort of state as a typical Chinese person lives today?
So China coming over and, taking over the U.S. Obviously is pretty far out there. But I think the idea, just first of all, that, there are elements even within democratic societies that favor a more authoritarian approach. And I think at minimum, China would look for ways to heighten internal tensions within countries like the United States, just so that they're so paralyzed, they're so focused on their inner political strife that they ultimately can't be effective actors against China. I think in addition, China, it would just mean that big parts of the world, essentially, this is why people describe it as a new Cold War, that you have the emergence of these clashing blocks between maybe a U.S.-led coalition and a Chinese coalition. And that just means a much more divided world than the one that we've all gotten used to. It means at minimum, your technologies won't work. When you travel from one block to another, it'll be a whole different digital universe. Your precious social media apps probably won't be available. Your cell phone won't work. But I think it also means a more militarized Asia, because obviously you have many more tensions there. It also may mean just distinct trading blocks between the two countries, and maybe that you can have some sort of peaceful coexistence between them. But I just worry that history suggests both sides will use, at minimum, every non-military coercive tool to try to expand their spheres. So, sanctions, tariffs, cyber attacks, but possibly also military coercion or even attacks to try to expand their sphere at the other's expense. So you get locked in this sort of zero-sum world of competing blocks. Again, this is why people describe it as sort of a Cold War type situation with the ever possibility of a hot war.
Mm-hmm. Well, Michael, for people who want to follow along with you as you keep tracking this, where should folks look for you online?
So I just have a website where I try to put as many of my writings up there for free. So it's just michaelbeckley.org. And I'm a professor at Tufts, so I have a webpage there, and a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where they also collect all of my work. So you could really quickly scroll through it. I respond to emails. I'm always happy to chat with folks. So that's probably the easiest way to contact me.
Great. Well, we'll put links to all that in the description for people who want to check that out. And Michael, my final question is, what do you think are the best things that the U.S. can do to maintain the world order?
That's a really good question. I think, a key point that Hal and I make in the book is that you sort of need two strategies. You obviously need the long-term strategy to outpace China and to build a system, really. That's really the key goal, is to build a system that makes the world safe for democracy and free trade and individual rights, and just basic security for all the countries that have cropped up over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. But you also need a short-term strategy to blunt what we worry could be a surge of Chinese repression and aggression, and that the focus right now needs to be on sort of circling the wagons so that we can get to the long game, where America and its allies' advantages, I think, are really quite substantial. And this is sort of similar to the early Cold War, where, American policymakers were fairly confident that communism would ultimately prove bankrupt, but they just worry that it was on the march because you had the Soviet military deployed across a shattered Eurasia, and communism was gaining popularity. So there's this sort of danger zone then, and we just think there's one now. And so the two main ways to get through it are, first of all, just to recognize that time is short, that you have to move fast. You have to use things that you have on hand now and really prevent China from scoring near-term victories that could radically upend the long-term trends. So that means obviously preventing a Chinese conquest of Taiwan. That means preventing China from monopolizing choke points in the global economy, things that people can't live without, like computer chips or 5G telecommunications or medical supplies, or access to finance. The U.S. doesn't need to become dominant in any of those areas, but it just needs to create a multilateral range of alternatives just to prevent, as I said before, the Amazon effect of China monopolizing these areas. And then the second lesson is just to not overreach. So because the long-term trends are favorable, the United States certainly doesn't need to oppose every Chinese initiative, stamping out every domino that could possibly fall. So if China wants to build some tunnels or roads or hospitals, across the global south, that's probably not something the United States should stand in the way. I mean, I think the areas where the United States trades with China should continue to vastly outweigh the areas where it sets up restrictions. And you should avoid symbolic moves that just provoke China but don't actually do anything to deter it. So, Nancy Pelosi's recent visit to Taiwan is a good illustration of just a way of poking China, but doesn't really help the Taiwanese defend themselves. So I think those are the main areas. And the hope is just you can get to a longer term position where you can then negotiate with the Chinese from a position of strength, and then can hopefully refold. I still think the vision of a liberal order that China becomes a reluctant, if not responsible stakeholder in, should be the long-term goal. But I just think right now there's these short-term threats that have to be dealt with in ways that actually require selectively degrading Chinese capabilities, doing deterrence, and preparing for damage limitation if China does decide to go on the offensive in various areas.
Well, Michael, thank you for bringing this important nuance to the discussion of China. I really appreciate you spending the time to discuss it with me. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for watching this episode with Michael Beckley. To help get more great guests on the show, be sure to subscribe.